Hello, good afternoon. Thank you guys very much for joining me. We're going to talk about ethical monetization. But first, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Crystin Cox. I've been making games for a little over 16 years. Been mostly as a designer and then as a game director. I worked at places like Disney and Nexon, and then I worked at ArenaNet, where I worked on Guild Wars 2 and all of our expansions, and I helped bring Guild Wars 2 to China, which was an exciting experience. Late last year, I left ArenaNet, and I joined Microsoft and the PlayFab team. How many people here have heard of PlayFab? Okay, a couple. Well, PlayFab is a back-end set of tools and services that enables LiveOps. And since my whole career has been focused on operating live games, I feel very passionately about live games and the future of the industry as it pertains to doing LiveOps really, really well. I joined that team in order to be a LiveOps evangelist, and now I spend my time going around and working with developers all over the world and helping them make a transition to the LiveOps mentality and also help solve their problems in LiveOps. So, as I was saying, a lot of my career has been spent in live games, specifically MMOs. So, in the early 2000s, like very early 2000s, I was working on traditional subscription-based MMOs for Disney. I worked with the team that did Toontown Online, and we were working on making another game called Pirates of the Caribbean Online, which nobody played, but that's okay. It was fun to make. So, I was working on these subscription-based MMOs. And I got to spend a lot of time with our customer support team. And since this was very, very long time ago, if you wanted to cancel your subscription to one of our games, you had to call us on the phone and actually talk to us about canceling your subscription. And I saw a lot of frustration come out of this. And I myself was frustrated by the situation with subscription-based monetization. I saw that we really favored the idea of people signing up for a subscription and then maybe just forgetting about it and continuing to be charged even if they weren't really playing the game. And I saw it sort of push us in a way that sometimes made us do things like say, oh, you know, our best players are the ones who never log in. At the same time, I was doing a lot of competitive analysis for us. And because Western developers very rarely make games for children, it's actually really, really rare for a Western developer to make a kids game, all of my competitive analysis was pretty much focused on games that were made in Asia. So I was playing a lot of games that were developed in Korea and Japan. And that exposed me to the idea of free-to-play back in the early 2000s. And I thought it was absolutely amazing. I was like, wow, this solves all of our problems. It's like, try before you buy. It's a la carte. It's just so much more empowering for the player. This is it. This is where we should be heading. And no one at Disney was interested in this at all. They were like, absolutely not. We are not interested in free to play. What are you talking about? These sort of, trashy MMOs that are being developed out of Asia. But I was undeterred, so I quit Disney. And I went to work for Nexon so that I could learn how to do free-to-play. And now when I look back at that, I realize that I was very naive. And it was a bit silly of me to think that a specific monetization strategy was going to fix all of our problems with our relationships with our players. And I think it's kind of funny. I tell people, yeah, I got into free-to-play because I thought it was more ethical. But I think that where that came from, this thing that I was seeing happening in my own studio, is very true. Is because there is this tension, there is this thing that happens when we bring money into the equation. And that is this truth we all have to live with, which is no matter what our monetization strategy is, it's going to deeply impact our relationship with our players. And it's going to deeply impact the design of our games. And there's really very little way around that. I know there's a lot of people in the industry that wish that wasn't true and maybe try to just hide from it. But no matter what you do, whatever your monetization strategy is, whether it's you're giving it away completely for free and there's no monetization at all because you're just an artist who has no business ambitions, or you're very, very motivated by business KPIs, your monetization strategy is going to have a deep impact on the way that you relate to your players, because it is an important thing, the way that you ask for money from your audience. So that brings us to ethics. When I started thinking about this a little later in my career, after I spent many years doing monetization design, I spent many years working on a lot of different games, mostly free to play, and then moved back into the premium space, I realized that a lot of where this tension happens revolves around ethics. At my last job, when I was at ArenaNet, I managed monetization strategy for the studio. And really what that meant, sort of fundamentally, was that it was my job to fight about monetization. I fought about monetization professionally. A lot of people fight about monetization on the internet on an amateur level, but I got to do it professionally for many, many years. And I almost never fought about monetization with our players. That was actually incredibly rare. They mostly don't want to talk about monetization, it turns out. But I did fight all the time with developers. And fight maybe is a strong word. We argued respectfully about monetization a lot because game developers feel really, really strongly about monetization. Those arguments tend to come in basically two flavors. The first one is, I want to make money. So I had people come up to me probably 3 or 4 times a week in the studio. It is a studio of about 400 people. So I'd have different people come up to me every week to say, I want to do this thing because it's going to make us so much money. And everyone has an idea and everyone thinks they know sort of what's going to make the most money. So this is a conference, and a lot of times what I'd have to respond to is either, well, I don't know about that, or I'm not sure that's actually going to be as performant as you think it is, all the way over to, oh my God, no one can ever know we had this conversation. That's terrible. Please never tell anyone you said that. But really, they come in all shapes and sizes. The next big argument is sort of the flip side of this is, I don't want to feel like a bad person. And I got this a lot too. A lot of people come to me and be like, I'm worried about something we're doing. I'm worried players aren't going to like us. I'm worried they're going to be mad. I'm worried something because I don't want to feel like I'm a bad person. And a lot of times people would sort of phrase these arguments to me as if they were opposed, which luckily is not true, right? Game monetization is not a zero-sum game. It is not a world we live in where like the worse you treat your players, the more money you make. Although I know it can feel that way sometimes. That isn't really the way that it works, thank goodness. But there is tension between these two things. There is a tension between what we need as developers in order to sustain our business and sustain ourselves, and how we want to present ourselves to our players and what our players want from us. And in that tension is where ethics lives. And I think it's where the solution to that tension lives too. So ethics. This is the part of the talk where I actually define ethics. I tried to get around it, but I think it has to happen. So ethics are guidelines that we all use to operate within the bounds of society. Ethics are, by definition, set by society. They are the rules of engagement in society that make sure that we act in a pro-social way. When we're acting unethically, we're acting in an anti-social way, something that hurts society. When we're acting ethically, we're acting in a way that is pro-social and it helps society. Ethics are not morals. These are actually two distinctive things. The big distinction, if we don't want to get deep into philosophy and the origin of those two words, is that the idea around morals is that they come from a higher power. They're a set of guidelines that is set down by something greater than society. That could be spiritual, it could be environmental, it could be the universe, it could be chaos, whatever it is. The idea around morals is that they are unchanging. They are a universal truth. But ethics are changing all the time. Ethics are the rules that society sets up, and they're not usually well defined. Like, we don't all sit down together, as we enter adulthood and say, okay, now that you're becoming an adult, here are all the rules that society has for you. Just follow these and you're going to be all good. Unfortunately, it's way more fluid than that. And so we don't always know exactly where the boundaries are, and a lot of times we spend a lot of time pushing on those boundaries, and society is always pushing on them and changing them. But it also means that when we talk about ethics, the ethics of this room, if we think about this room as a society, this room has a different set of ethics than a room of the same size in Mongolia, or a room of the same size in southern United States, because we are a slightly different mix of people. That does make ethics pretty complicated, but if you think of it, in a sense that we all do this every day, all day, right? We all actually operate on ethical guidelines. Whether you've ever sat down and thought about what your ethical guidelines are, you're doing it constantly as long as you're actually continuing to live in society and interact with other people. The thing that is rough about this, because of what ethics are, because of their definition as being the rules of engagement in society, something else that gets us in trouble a lot when we try to talk about ethics in the workplace is this idea of business ethics. But unfortunately, there's no such thing as business ethics. Business ethics actually don't exist. Despite some laws that were passed by the American government, businesses are not people, actually. So there's only personal ethics. Businesses cannot actually make independent decisions in order to act inside of society. People inside of businesses ultimately make all of those decisions. And I know that that can be rough because not every single person inside of a business has equal control over the kinds of decisions that get made at a business level. They don't have complete autonomy. But regardless of whether or not you personally feel like your decisions are driving the ethics of your business, some person's decisions are driving the ethics of business. We have to take responsibility for that, right? There is not some mythical idea of a business that operates on its own set of ethics. And in fact, a lot of studies have been done around how people perceive ethics in business and how people do ethics in business. And the further away, if you have ethical guidelines at your business, the further away those are from your personal ethics, the more trouble you're going to get into, the more difficult you're going to find working. So the fact that ethics are all personal and they all come down to the decisions that we all make in order to operate in society causes some trouble with those arguments we talked about before. Oftentimes, in our attempt to distance ourselves from that personal responsibility, we get versions of those arguments that we talked about before, right? The I want to make money argument turns into I'm obligated to make money because that's the point of business. This idea that there's some kind of purpose in business that obligates us to maximize revenue is brought up a lot. I'm not a lawyer. This gets has been brought up to me many times that like there's some kind of legal responsibility of publicly traded businesses to maximize revenue. I'm not a lawyer. I have spoken to ethics lawyers about this, and they're like, I don't know where that comes from. That's not a thing. So this is mostly, I think, just a way for us to try to distance ourselves to say, yeah, even though I might be making different ethical decisions in business, it's okay because I have this pressure or this other driving force. The other one, the I don't want to feel like a bad person argument, often gets turned into, it's not my fault if players do something bad or have a bad experience. They should be more responsible. Or the worst version of this, which I've actually heard out of a developer's mouth, players are just stupid. So I guess the unspoken second half of that is, so it's okay to take advantage of them, which is actually not an ethical guideline that exists in really any modern society. The idea of sort of, if people are weak, then it is just okay and you're totally ethically cleared to take advantage of them is not something that, there may be a society somewhere where that actually is totally fine, but it's certainly not a mainstream one and not one that we usually operate in. So that's not a great ethical guideline to use. So whether or not we like it, we're all responsible for the efficacy of our actions, right? And as we make video games, a lot of us actually work in relatively small teams and actually have quite a lot of influence on the decisions that we make. And we can actually bring a lot of our own ethics into the decisions that we make around monetization. And we should. We should think about this really, really carefully because video games are very, very important to people. Right? You could make the argument that we aren't actually more obligated to care about ethics than anyone else, say like a grocer. You could be like, why should we have to be more ethical than a grocery store? But the truth is, when was like the last time that someone wrote a 50-page fanfic about lettuce? Right? Like video games are different. In fact, video games are culture. They're a very specific kind of thing that's very important to society called culture. There used to be this big debate, at least when I was earlier in my career, about whether games were art. But that almost doesn't matter because they definitely are culture. whether we want them to be or not. And culture is this sort of warm, fuzzy center of society, right? Like people feel really passionately about culture, right? They do things like dress up as characters and go to conventions and write fanfics, and they do all of these things because they're deeply, deeply invested in video games and the things that we make. And so our relationship with them is also slightly more complicated. And we have to think about the ethics of how we ask these people who are very deeply invested in what we do for money more deeply, I believe. So how do we do that, right? How do we actually juggle this, right? We have a need to make money. We have this incredibly passionate group of people who are our customers, ultimately. How do we actually manage those passions? Well, I think one of the first things is we use ethical monetization. We actually bring the principles of efficacy into our monetization discussions and think about them deeply and think about them in a very focused and intentional way. But what does that mean, right? What does it actually mean to do ethical monetization as opposed to just any kind of monetization? At its core, it's really about the two desires I was talking about before, and the basis of all of those arguments. You want to treat your players fairly, and I've met very few developers who don't want to treat their players fairly. And you want to make money and sustain your business. Both of those things are things that you want and need. Ethical monetization means doing both, right? Ethical monetization is about compromise. It's about finding those win-wins where what you do is good for you, and it's also good for the people who are playing your game. That's actually the basis for most societal ethics, right? It's a balancing act where we find out how to satisfy the needs of the individual against the needs of the group. And getting those win-wins is what's key to this. It does mean things like designing your game and every single monetization aspect of your game in a way that takes into account how it's good for you and how it's good for your players who are purchasing things. Now, it's fairly easy for me to stand up here and say this, but actually, I'm not going to lie to you, this is really hard. I've been working at it for a number of years at this point, and it's very challenging. There's a number of really specific challenges, such as games are very complicated. How do you even know what your players think is fair? Like, do you really know what your community actually sees as fair? And if your game is complicated enough, this could be mixed up in all kinds of communication issues and confusion. Is this really unfair, or do players just not understand it? This is actually really challenging. The second is, other people are doing exploitative things, and they're succeeding. And that is legitimately frustrating. I could stand up here and argue with you and even look at data that says they're not succeeding long term, but that doesn't always help when an executive's coming up and saying, oh, did you see what this company's doing? We should be doing that. Because I just saw their quarterly returns and oh my gosh, they're amazing. Or when you look at something that someone's doing and you see them get all these numbers and all this attention, and you're like, they're doing it, why can't I do it? And those kinds of things, they're doing it, why can't I do it? That is something that picks away at efficacy in a society. And finally, it's really scary to do this. Can you trust your players? So I'm not going to talk about it much in this talk, but efficacy is a two-way street. We need to treat our players ethically. We do need them to reciprocate and treat us ethically. That means compensating us for our labor. That means not abusing us. That means, interacting with our work and our communities in a fair and conscientious way. We can't always be sure of that. You could do everything right. You could make a bunch of great ethical decisions that are very pro-social, and maybe players just don't show up to support you. And that's really scary. And so doing ethical monetization is, in fact, very challenging. And I'm not going to lie and say, I'll just follow these 3 steps and everything will be golden. But what I can say is there is one thing you can do. One simple thing you can do, fairly simple thing you can do today that will drastically increase the efficacy of your monetization decisions and the monetization strategies that you have. And that is to set ethical standards for your game. If there's one thing you take away from this talk today, the one thing I want you to leave with is I want you all to be thinking about going back to your teams and having this conversation. Because the thing that really drives making good ethical decisions about your monetization strategy is actually making sure your team is thinking about making ethical decisions about your monetization strategy. And that isn't going to happen if you're just sitting in a corner sort of contemplating this. You have to have the really hard conversations. You have to actually sit down with your leaders on your team or in your studio and actually draw the lines and ask the honestly very uncomfortable question of, what are we willing to do? What are we not willing to do? And set that down, and then communicate it out to your team and use it as a guideline and use it as a quality standard for everything that you put inside of your game. If you can do that, then you will find that you are making better decisions about monetization on a consistent basis, because when things get really rough and you're not going to meet your revenue target, or the forums are exploding, or the server is down, it's really tough not to make a bad decision. And those bad decisions can really cost you as far as your relationship with your players. Because when you're under pressure and you don't have any guidelines to go off, you're just going with your gut. And today, because we're in a lot of trouble, it does make sense. We're going to do this thing that maybe yesterday you wouldn't have said yes to. If you want to have a long-term relationship with your players and a long-term strategy for your game, set ethical standards for your game. Now, what should those ethical standards be? I can't answer that question for you because I don't actually know the society you're operating your game in. And it's a little bit different for everybody. And, if you're making a game for kids under the age of 16 in Korea, it's a very different set of ethics than if you're making a game for 35 to 40-year-old women in Europe. Those are two different societies. They have different expectations. They have different things that they say are fair. So I can't really tell you, this is the list of things, just do this, and that's what your ethical standards should be. However, there are two things that have come up over and over and over again for me in my career when I've done this exercise with my teams that I think are really worth thinking about as you do sit down and have this hard conversation. So I'm going to go over those. And the first one is regret. So last year, I was on a panel about in-game economies at PAX. And we had about 300 people in the room, and our panel moderator asked them to raise their hands if they had ever bought a microtransaction. And of course, every hand in the room went up, because this is the world, this is the way the video game industry is today. It's not an unusual thing. Pretty much everyone who plays video games has bought a microtransaction. He then asked them to leave their hand up if they ever regretted buying a microtransaction. And about 50% of the hands stayed up. That's a lot. On the one hand, I wasn't surprised. On the other hand, it's actually a pretty low bar. Just make things that don't make people regret buying them. But it's something we don't consider a lot when we're designing games. We don't think about designing to avoid regret. And I think that that's a mistake. Regret is easy to happen. And when we stay super focused on, and I get it, mostly design is very focused on surprise and delight and making players happy and everything being wonderful. But game designers are sort of terrifying, actually. Game designers are trained to manipulate people. That's what we are trained to do. And if we're any good, we've probably actually deeply looked at human psychology and behavioral economics and all of those things to try to elicit the kind of behavior we want. And so if we don't think about this, if we don't keep regret top of mind, it's pretty easy actually to make things that are, in hindsight, obviously going to lead to purchaser regret. Regret sort of comes from generally one of three buckets. So the first is, what was purchased was not what was promised. This actually used to be a lot worse in the video game industry. We used to have a lot of sort of not quite truthful advertising that happened in video games. You would look at the back of the box of a game and it would list a bunch of features and show screenshots, and then you'd actually plug it into a console and it really wouldn't be that thing. The internet has helped this a little bit because there's more perfect information for players, but this still happens. We still have subtle versions of this too that happen all the time with in-app purchases. We do things like over-exaggerate how good this is going to be for you, or we even set up situations where the first time you use it, it seems really fantastic, and then later it doesn't. These might work kind of in the short term, but in the long term, they're going to lead to regret. A lot of this really comes from the legacy of game development. Game development before we had sort of games as a service and free-to-play was very focused on product. And so we were really focused on advertising. And we weren't as focused on satisfaction. We actually didn't care as much about whether or not players were happy after they played a game, unless you were building a franchise. Now we have to care a lot about satisfaction. So we really want to avoid this. The next thing that causes a lot of regret is purchasing was done without proper information. There's a lot of examples of this, but the one that springs to most people's minds right away is loot boxes. Because loot boxes are very difficult to understand before you purchase them. I don't think they're impossible. I've designed quite a few loot boxes in my day, and I actually like loot boxes. I know, don't kill me. But they are difficult for players to understand. And we have to deal with that, because if the player does not know what they're going to get when they buy something, whether it's a loot box or something else, if they really don't understand what kind of value is going to come out, then they're going to be unhappy, because they are probably, almost certainly, going to imagine a greater value than the one you actually put in there. And so you need to be careful about communicating that. I've had a lot of people suggest to me that the way to solve this problem for loot boxes is to publicly put the drop chances for a loot box in the game or on your website. I think that that's a nice idea, but I would caution you all to understand that humans are very bad at math, like ridiculously bad. We're really bad at percentage math. We do not understand chance. That is not something we are good at. And so, yes, players may like to see the odds, post them, that's great, but that's not necessarily going to take care of this situation for you. Because a player can look at a list of odds and still not understand what their value is, and still not have any idea what they're going to get out of a loot box when they open it. I favor stuff that's a little bit more holistic and is a little bit more upfront in its communication, just really highlighting to players, like, this is exactly what's in the box. You know, this is you're very likely to get this. You're less likely to get this. If something is incredibly rare, being very honest about this is very rare. You're probably not going to get it. You're probably not going to get the ultra rare shiny gold plated item right away. And then I also favor making sure the players have an outlet for things, because one way you can help with regret is to actually give players a way to turn what they got. If they got something they weren't necessarily expecting or didn't necessarily want, give them something else they can do with it. The last way that regret happens is purchasing was done under duress. This is becoming really common in video games right now. And I get it. There's a lot of demand for people's attention right now. And it can be challenging to keep people's attention. And so we crank up the heat, and we try to make it feel like, oh my God, I have this incredible fear of missing out. And now it's cranked all the way up to, I'm in literal danger. And that's where you get into trouble. When you actually create a situation where players feel like they are in danger if they don't make this purchase. And it can be deceptive what that actually looks like. There's a fantastic GDC talk by Chelsea Howe called The Design of Time. I encourage you guys to look it up. It's on the Vault, where she discusses the challenges that we face in dealing with attention economics, essentially. And she talks about some studies that were done where they measured the brain activity in people when they were exposed to like a snake, like people who are afraid of snakes, and the brain activity when they're exposed to a headline of an article that's something like 5 signs your spouse is cheating on you. And your brain responds to both of those things identically. It does not understand the difference between physical danger and emotional danger. In the scary part of our old reptilian brain, danger is danger. And so when you activate that danger, whether it's emotional danger or physical danger, a lot of your higher functions shut down. And then you start making decisions based on fight or flight or tend to befriend, really basic human instincts. Once you come out of that state, you might find that you don't like the things that you did. And so purchasing under duress can really activate that for people. I don't think this means you can't have things that are time limited, or you can't have things that do have some urgency to them. You just need to watch out. Don't tip over that scale into actual danger. An example I like to give of this, to illustrate it a little bit better, is one that's interesting because I think a lot of people really don't consider these a problem, but I have a lot of questions about them, and that is server transfers in MMOs. So server transfers in MMOs are a fee that you pay, and it's usually a very high fee, to move your character from one server to another. That's not really a big deal until you realize that behaviorally, the reason that people do this is they're trying to gain access to their friends. So essentially, you've taken their friends hostage, and if they want access to them, they're going to have to fork over $15. And when we actually look at data from MMOs over a long period of time, what we found was that just after making a server transfer, players were 3 times more likely to quit the game forever. And I think that that might have something to do with this. It doesn't feel great to kind of be extorted in order to get access to your friends. Now, there's lots of other reasons people used to do server transfer fees, but just as an example, purely from a player's perspective, that can be problematic. So all of this is just to say that designing to prevent regret is something that you should be folding into your decisions, especially when you're talking about designing things that are directly related to monetization. Because if we can avoid regret, if we can raise the chance that players feel happy after they make a purchase, we're going to know that we're actually doing a better job of acting within those pro-social bounds of ethics. So that's regret. The next thing I want to talk about is price. So it's not surprising that price is one of the major considerations for me when I think about efficacy, because price is a very touchy subject for a lot of people, and cost are something that often generate the debates we do see with players online. And that's not really surprising, right? When we price something, we really have all the power, right? Like, the developer gets to decide what it costs, and the player doesn't really get to say anything about it. And so we have a mismatch and a power dynamic there. And a lot of unethical actions come from power imbalances. So it's not really surprising that this area could be fraught with ethical issues, because really, we make this choice, and a lot of times we make this choice, honestly, I see a lot of teams make this choice without a lot of deep research, and we just sort of decide on a price. And when I talk to teams about this, what I hear is, what are you talking about? There is no power imbalance here. If players don't like a price, they can just not pay it. Because we have this great thing, right? If you all took a early education economics class in microeconomics, you've probably seen this chart. It's a supply and demand chart for free markets. And we have this idea that it'll balance itself out, right? Like, if we charge something and players don't like it, they'll push back and the price will get lowered, and we'll all reach this fantastic equilibrium, because that's the way the market works. The problem with this is that whenever I talk to a lot of developers about free market equilibrium, they leave out a couple of key points. They get the supply and demand part right, but they miss some of the environmental factors, some of the requirements in order to reach free market equilibrium. In order to actually get to equilibrium, you must have perfect competition. A player must be able to satisfy their demand from somewhere else other than you. They must be able to get the same good in 2 different places. That is a requirement. You must also have perfect consumer knowledge. There must be no hidden information from the consumer. They must be able to make an absolutely, totally informed comparison between 2 products. And finally, you must have ease of entry. And this is one that I know is sort of not that popular in, free market economies today, but this is actually a mathematical requirement for reaching equilibrium. It must be easy for a competitor to come into the market and challenge you. And as you guys probably know, games don't really have any of these. We don't actually meet any of these requirements. And in fact, really, games are mostly a monopoly. That's actually the economic model that we operate on. This is nothing against Fortnite, but I love that there's Monopoly Fortnite. That's incredible branding. I have no idea what it would be like, but it's probably pretty cool. But all games really operate mostly as a monopoly if we talk about economic modeling. And the reason for that is that you actually supply something that players can only get from you. Now, at a meta level, that's not true, because there's tons of competition for entertainment. But once a player is actually engaged and invested in your game, if you are doing a relatively good job of retaining them, that becomes very untrue. And so if we're talking about DLC, if we're talking about in-app purchases, any of those things, you're firmly in the monopoly land. And monopolies act very differently than free market economies do. To illustrate that a little bit, I do want to talk a little bit about socially optimal price. So if you've worked at all in monetization in games, you've probably talked about revenue optimizing price. This is the price you can set things at where you make the most money. And it's obviously a thing that we talk about all the time, like, how do we get the revenue optimized price? How do we set the price such that we get the most money? But we don't often talk about other prices. because we think the free market is going to keep us from having to worry about this. We think, well, whatever we charge, if it makes the most money, it was obviously correct. But since we know we're in a monopoly, that's not really true. And in fact, in a monopoly, people will continue to pay for things at a very high price, even if they really, really don't want to, and even if it's hurting them. So this chart is actually used by the American government to set price ceilings for life-saving drugs. And in this chart, you see the socially optimal price over there. So this is the price that a life-saving drug would be set at in order to have the least number of people die in society. So society pays the least cost in that case. The revenue optimizing price way up here, that's a lot more death. And so there's a huge social cost associated with that. And in this case, it's grim and morbid, but it is really easy for people to understand. Obviously, there's a huge cost to society if a bunch of people die. But if we don't set any kind of restrictions here, and the company wants to do the revenue optimized price, well, they can charge a lot of money for drugs that save your life. In fact, people will generally pay whatever they can in order to obtain a drug that'll save their lives. And that number is so high that they don't have to sell lots of them, because they're making so much money on the ones they do sell. And so if we don't actually consider this other factor, we're obviously going to end up in a pretty rough situation. I'm not going to dig into more about this. If you want to get really angry, you can look up what fair return price is. Luckily in games, we're not actually having to calculate our social cost in death. That's nice. But we do have to calculate social cost. Whatever you set your prices at, you are having to pay some amount of social cost for that price that you are setting. Now, the sum cost is inevitable, right? It's a trade-off. It's a back and forth. The only way to have totally socially optimal pricing for video games would be everything to be free. But we don't want to go crazy either and say we don't care about those social costs, because they can really bite you later. One example of this is that 10, 15 years ago, first-person shooters would often charge for DLC maps in their competitive mode. So if you wanted to play on the new map, you'd have to buy it. And what this did was it split the player base. So the people that bought the map had access to it, but they were a smaller group than the whole group of people who'd bought the original game. That's a social cost. You made some money off that map, but you just encouraged a whole bunch of your players who did not buy that map to stop playing, because they're now not playing the new thing. They're not engaging in the new competitive space. We decided as an industry pretty much that we didn't want to pay that social cost anymore. And nowadays it's really rare to find a first-person shooter game that charges for DLC maps specifically. They shifted over to charging for different things that have lower social cost, so that they could keep their player bases large and keep their retention high. So that's a really obvious one. Another example is if you have a free-to-play game and you set the price of all your microtransactions or in-app purchases really, really high, you're sending a message to everyone that comes into play that this is a game that's only for people who spend a lot of money. And you're going to pay a social cost for that. A lot of people who might have been willing to give you $5 or $6 instead of $150 are not going to play, because you told them this isn't really the game for them. And so that's a social cost in order to keep in mind. And a lot of times when we think about social costs, what we really are thinking about is purchasing power. Right? We're thinking about the fact that players have different levels of disposable income. They have different capabilities in order to actually spend on your game. And when we don't think about that, if we just optimize for the revenue optimizing price, if we just optimize for the people who can pay us the most, we're going to cut off a lot of people. And maybe that's fine for you. You may make a decision, yeah, this is a super premium game. I only want people with LTVs in the $400 range. That's your choice, but I definitely recommend you make that choice with your eyes open and think about what you're doing instead of just having that happen to you naturally because you subtly cut everyone else out of the loop. Okay, so before we open it up for questions, which I think we'll have maybe a few minutes for, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts about ethical monetization. Your game's monetization strategy is an integral part of your game, and it is a message that you send out into the world with your game. It's hugely important to your players. It should be hugely important to you. I don't think we're at a point where we would put great monetization on the back of a box or like in our list of features in a collector's edition, but I actually hope we get there. I hope that we are proud of the monetization that we send out into the world, and that we are very cognizant of the fact that it is something that defines our games and that players think about a lot when they think of our games. Additionally, ethics should really be part of your quality evaluation. I really encourage you guys to set those ethical guidelines and then actually review the things that go into your game and make sure they meet them. Just like we check for bugs, we check for stability, we should be checking to make sure everything we put in the world is ethical. And finally, ethics are not laws. In fact, laws mostly exist to protect society from people acting unethically. I think that game developers should be significantly more conscious of the efficacy of their monetization decisions. But if we aren't, then eventually governments will step in and they will do things to limit our damage to society. I don't know if they'll do the right things. I don't know if they'll make good decisions, but they will try. If we are seen as antisocial, if we are seen as damaging society, they will step in and they will do something about it. And we are a young industry, but we're very powerful. And we oftentimes don't realize how quickly we can change things and how quickly we can have a huge impact on ourselves. But we also have a lot of capacity for destruction. If we look at the rise and fall of social gaming on Facebook, it was this huge boom. Players came in, a lot of new players who had not really participated in games before, and we acted very short-sightedly, and we destroyed that. Right? We actually forced Facebook to stop allowing people to send messages to each other and gifts to each other. If you think of it really objectively, that's a little crazy. We made a social media platform be like, don't let people contact each other. But we have that power. We can totally do that. So I highly encourage you all to not think short-sightedly, to think about this industry and the way that it exists in the society that you operate in, and how we can be pro-social and how we can have a positive impact on the societies that we serve. So just a quick recap. Set ethical guidelines, design to avoid regret, consider social cost, be proud of your monetization. Thank you, guys. We only have like 2 minutes. I just want to make sure I give a special thanks to Project Horseshoe. This talk started as a white paper for Project Horseshoe. Project Horseshoe is fantastic. I know it's got a silly name, but check it out. It's just www.projecthorseshoe.com. There's a lot of fantastic white papers about game design. And also big thanks to the PlayFab team who could not be here. So I don't know if we maybe have time for like one question. I can't see any of you, just so you know. There's like light right in my face, so.
I have a question.
Awesome.
Yeah. So do you have any ideas on how to segment players based on income? And I asked this because it would allow you to maximize both reach and revenues, but would also keep prices fair and affordable to everyone?
Yeah, so one way to do it, it depends on how much information you have about your player base. If you have some demographic information, you can actually make a pretty good guess. And it can be very sort of crude at first, if you need it to be. Things like, especially as I worked on a lot of games that were targeted mostly at kids. Kids don't have credit cards. They don't have a lot of spending power, right? They tend to have very, very low spending power. So if your demographics are like under 16 years old, probably very little spending power, as opposed to, hey, if your demographic is 40-year-olds, probably a lot more. So you can start with some demographic information, and then you actually, I'm a big fan of the slow rollout for games, so phased flighting in launching a game instead of just putting it all out there at once. So I highly recommend taking the time to slowly launch your game and gather information about the players that come in before you make all of your decisions about how to monetize. In order to actually start gathering information about the way that players react to things, and if they're actually, highly sensitive to price sensitivity, or they're highly sensitive to the idea of buying something at a very, very cheap price, and gather some of that segmentation information before you do full monetization, before you do full rollout to the rest of the world. I think we have like 1 minute left. Maybe we could do one more if there is one more.
Here's one.
Great.
Over here, other side. I'm an economist, so I appreciated your talk. I was wondering if you could comment on philanthropy and the opportunity to do good with the enormous number of gamers that you might have, or the sheer force of bringing together numerous gaming organizations together to create change in the world. So Supercell is a great example of going carbon neutral. And also to comment that there's a session on Friday on corporate social responsibility at 11.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we have an incredible opportunity there. That we've seen things happen where we've asked, gaming communities to donate, or we've asked gaming communities to get behind certain charities or causes, and they've responded incredibly well, because games are culture, and they really do occupy this incredibly emotional aspect of our society. But additionally, as you said, because we are trying to act pro-socially, we are trying to be a positive impact on the society that we operate in, taking those opportunities to do things like going carbon neutral, or saying, we're going to donate some percentage of our revenue always to a particular charity we support, or just honestly standing up and taking a stance as a company on social issues and the things that you believe in, can have a hugely positive impact also on your community and community building, and then following on retention. So, well, thank you guys very much. I'm going to get off the stage and make way for the next talk.